4:15 in the morning. The Strait of Hormuz. USS Carl Vinson was carving a steady wake through the dark water when the first acoustic transient was recorded by the sonar suite of its lead escort. The aircraft carrier had been conducting flight operations for 6 hours, cycling F-35 Bravo Lightning fighters onto the deck, but the signature now blooming on the screens was anything but routine. The humid air over the Persian Gulf was heavy with the smell of jet fuel and sea salt, pressing down on the sailors of Carrier Strike Group 1. Below the waterline, the silent pressure of the deep was about to be shattered by a kinetic event of catastrophic proportions. 12 miles to the north, at coordinates 26 degrees 12 minutes north and 55 degrees 48 minutes east, the Iranian Kilo-class submarine Nooh sat in a thermal layer that masked its heat and sound. The Iranian commander had waited 3 days for this specific window of opportunity. The submarine was running on battery power, silent and invisible against the jagged topography of the seafloor. With a single command, the forward torpedo tubes were flooded. There was no mechanical whine, only the dull thud of high-pressure air as two 53-65 wake-homing torpedoes were ejected into the current. The torpedoes were sophisticated killers, designed not to seek a specific sound, but to find the physical turbulence left behind by a massive hull. They accelerated instantly to 45 knots, their internal guidance systems locking onto the churning water produced by the 4 massive propellers of the American carrier. On the bridge of the destroyer, USS Kidd, the sonar technician shouted a warning that the carrier strike group was under active torpedo attack, but the physics of the engagement were already locked. The wake-homing sensors ignored the acoustic decoys launched by the escort ships, staying true to the massive trail of bubbles and pressure trailing behind the 100,000-ton nuclear-powered vessel. The first torpedo struck the port side of USS Carl Vinson at 4:16 in the morning. It did not detonate on the outer skin of the ship. Instead, the shaped charge warhead punched through the anti-torpedo blisters and exploded deep within the secondary hull structure. A column of white water and pulverized steel erupted 300 feet into the air, drenching the parked aircraft on the hangar deck. The shockwave traveled through the keel of the ship with enough force to snap heavy machinery from its mounts in the lower engineering spaces. 3 seconds later, the second torpedo found the same entry point. This second detonation occurred inside a fuel bunker that had already been breached by the first strike. The resulting explosion was a white-hot flash that bleached the darkness of the Gulf night. Thick, black smoke began to boil out of the jagged hole in the side of the carrier, a wound that measured 12 meters across. Seawater began to roar into the ship at a rate of 6,000 tons per minute. Inside the carrier, the sudden list to port was immediate and violent. In the main engine room, sailors were thrown against steel bulkheads as the deck tilted 7 degrees in less than 60 seconds. As the deck tilted 7 degrees in less than 60 seconds, the sound of tearing metal was a constant, screaming backdrop to the blaring general quarters alarms. Red emergency lights bathed the compartments in a bloody glow as the automatic fire suppression systems began to spray fine mist into the smoke-filled corridors. The professional discipline of the United States Navy took hold instantly, even as the smell of burning electrical insulation and raw fuel oil filled the lungs of every man and woman on board. Damage control teams, moving in heavy protective gear, began to scramble toward the sound of the rushing water, knowing that the survival of the most powerful ship in the fleet depended on the next 10 minutes. The carrier strike group began to scatter, executing a pre-planned defensive maneuver to protect the remaining assets while the escorts turned their sensors toward the depths. The peace of the morning had been obliterated. The Iranian submarine Nooh began to dive deeper, attempting to vanish into the deep trenches of the strait, leaving behind a burning giant that was fighting for its life. The sound was a deep, metallic groan that resonated through the very marrow of the ship. Inside the lower decks of the USS Carl Vinson, the world had tilted 8 degrees to port in less than 90 seconds. In the auxiliary machinery room number 4, located 35 feet below the waterline, the peace of the morning watch was replaced by a vertical wall of seawater. The first torpedo had shattered the outer hull and the heavy longitudinal bulkheads, turning the compartment into a pressurized death trap. 6 sailors, who had been monitoring the water purification systems, were lost in the first 3 seconds as the ocean claimed the space with the force of 1,000 fire hoses. The damage control officer in the central control station gripped the edge of his console as the deck shuddered again. The second explosion had been muffled by the rising water, but the vibration was more violent. It was the signature of a secondary detonation in the fuel storage bunkers. On the status boards, entire sections of the ship began to blink red. The United States Navy training, drilled into every sailor until it became instinct, took over the moment the alarms began to scream. There was no panic, only the frantic, coordinated movement of hundreds of men and women who knew that the next 10 minutes would decide if the 97,000-ton carrier stayed afloat or became a permanent fixture on the floor of the Persian Gulf. Repair Locker 5, located on the third deck, erupted into action. The team leader, a first-class petty officer with 15 years of experience, shouted orders over the roar of the emergency sirens. They moved in heavy, fire-resistant suits, carrying hydraulic jacks, timber shoring, and heavy steel plates. The air was already thick with the acrid, biting smell of burning electrical insulation and the heavy scent of vaporized diesel fuel. The lighting flickered and died, replaced instantly by the eerie, pulsing red of the emergency circuits. The deck was slick with a mixture of seawater and hydraulic fluid, making every step a gamble. By 4:22 in the morning, the list had reached 9 degrees. On the flight deck, 2 F-35 Bravo Lightning fighters, each weighing over 30,000 pounds, began to strain against their heavy steel tie-down chains. If the list reached 15 degrees, the chains would snap, and the aircraft would become unguided kinetic weapons, sliding across the deck and crushing anything in their path. The air boss ordered all non-essential personnel to the starboard side of the ship, using the human weight of thousands of sailors to act as a counterbalance to the flooding on the port side. Deep in the heart of the ship, the nuclear reactor technicians were executing emergency protocols. Reactor number 1 and reactor number 2 were still stable, but the shock of the torpedo hits had tripped several high-pressure steam lines. The engineers worked in a world of screaming steam and blistering heat, wearing thick gloves to turn manual valves that were almost too hot to touch. They had to isolate the damaged cooling loops before the pressure drop forced an automatic shutdown of the entire power plant. Without the reactors, the ship would lose its massive electric pumps, and the battle against the rising water would be lost. In the flooded compartments, the damage control teams were chest deep in oily, black water. They were working to zebra, the ship closing every watertight hatch, and scuttle to contain the flood to the initial impact zone. It was a brutal, terrifying task. In several locations, the pressure of the incoming water was so great that steel hatches were bowing inward, their gaskets whistling as the sea tried to force its way through. The sailors used heavy sledgehammers to drive wooden wedges into the gaps, fighting for every inch of dry deck. The medical department in the ship's sickbay was already receiving the first casualties. The deck was covered in non-skid material, but it was quickly becoming stained with blood. The chief medical officer and his team of corpsmen worked with clinical efficiency, triaging sailors who had been caught in the blast or burned by flash fires in the engineering spaces. They used morphine and high-pressure bandages to stabilize 42 personnel in the first 20 minutes. Despite the carnage, the atmosphere remained professional. Every sailor knew their role, and every role was critical to the survival of the USS Carl Vinson. At 4:35 in the morning, the damage control officer reported a small but vital victory to the bridge. The primary flooding had been isolated to 4 major compartments. The list had stabilized at 9 degrees. The massive electric bilge pumps, drawing power from the resilient nuclear reactors, were now moving 12,000 gallons of seawater per minute back into the Gulf. The ship was wounded, and she was heavy in the water, but the immediate threat of capsizing had been halted by the sheer will and technical skill of her crew. However, the crisis was far from over. As the sun began to hint at the horizon, the rest of Carrier Strike Group 1 was turning its sensors outward. The enemy was still out there, hidden in the dark, and the United States Navy was about to stop bleeding and start hunting. 4:38 in the morning. the destroyer USS Kidd and the destroyer USS Wayne E. Meyer. The two Arleigh Burke-class destroyers did not wait for orders from the wounded carrier as they throttled up to a flanking speed of 30 knots. The mission was no longer about protection. It was about finding the archer who had just fired the arrows. The Strait of Hormuz was now a tactical grid, a high-stakes chessboard where the United States Navy was deploying its most advanced sensors to peel back the layers of the ocean. The air over the destroyers was whipped into a sharp frenzy by the twin turbines of the MH-60 Romeo and MH-60 Sierra helicopters, their rotors beating against the humid Gulf air as they lifted from the pitching flight decks. The environment around the destroyers was a chaotic mix of spray and electronic energy. The hulls of the DDG-100 and the DDG-108 slammed into the 2-meter swells with a violence that sent green water cascading over the 5-inch gun mounts. The smell of high-octane aviation fuel and burnt marine diesel hung heavy in the wake of the ships. Inside the Combat Information Center, or the CIC, of the USS Kidd, the lighting was a dim, focused blue, designed to reduce eye strain for the sonar technicians who were now the most important people in the fleet. They were staring at the SQQ-89 Integrated Undersea Warfare Combat System, searching for the ghost that had vanished after the strike. At coordinates 26 degrees 15 minutes north, 55 degrees 47 minutes east, the USS Kidd began its active search pattern. The commanding officer ordered the ship to ping the water. The AN/SQS-53 Charlie hull-mounted sonar sent out a massive pulse of acoustic energy, a sound like a giant hammer striking a cathedral bell. To the sailors on the lower decks, the sound was a terrifying, metallic chirp that seemed to vibrate through their very teeth. High above the surface, two MH-60 Romeo helicopters from Helicopter Maritime Strike Squadron 73 reached the datum, the last known position of the torpedo launch. The pilots, wearing night vision goggles that bathed the world in a ghostly lime green, hovered at 40 feet. They deployed their dipping sonar, a specialized sensor lowered on a long cable into the depths. This sensor allowed them to listen below the thermal layers that often hid submarines from surface ships. They also began dropping a pattern of 32 sonobuoys, small floating tubes that broadcast underwater sounds back to the aircraft via radio links. The technical challenge was immense. The Persian Gulf is a shallow, noisy environment filled with the grinding sounds of shifting sand, the clicks of marine life, and the distant throb of commercial tankers. The Iranian Kilo-class submarine, the Nooh, was designed specifically for these conditions. Its hull was covered in thousands of rubber tiles, known as anechoic coatings, which were designed to absorb sonar pulses rather than reflect them. The Iranian commander was likely bottoming his boat, sitting perfectly still on a patch of rocky seafloor to blend in with the background clutter. The executive officer of the USS Wayne E. Meyer monitored the tactical data link, which shared a real-time picture between every ship and aircraft in the strike group. The screen showed a complex web of overlapping circles, representing the listening range of every sensor. They were squeezing the box, slowly reducing the area where the Kilo could hide. Every sailor in the CIC was silent, listening to the rhythmic pulse of the active sonar and the hiss of the passive arrays. The tension was a physical weight, heavier than the atmospheric pressure outside. Suddenly, a technician on the USS Kidd raised a hand. Contact. Evaluated as possible submerged contact. Bearing 095, range 8,000 yards. The signal was faint, a soft return that barely stood out from the surrounding seabed. It was located near a series of underwater ridges at a depth of 60 meters. The MH-60 Romeo helicopter was immediately vectored toward the contact. The pilot transitioned to a hover, the downwash from the rotors creating a circular pattern of white foam on the black water. The sensor operator in the back of the helicopter analyzed the return from the dipping sonar. "It's not a rock," the operator whispered over the intercom. "It's breathing. I've got a mechanical transient, possibly a cooling pump." The hunt was narrowing. The United States Navy had established a perimeter, a lethal radius, that the enemy submarine could not escape without being detected. The destroyers were now closing the distance. their Mark 41 vertical launch systems ready to provide a kinetic answer to the Iranian provocation. The commander of the Kid looked at the tactical display and adjusted his headset. The silence of the morning was about to be replaced by the roar of an American counterattack. 5:10 in the morning. The Iranian coastline near Bandar Jask. While the destroyers of Carrier Strike Group 1 were focused on the depths, a new threat was manifesting on the horizon. At coordinates 25 degrees 59 minutes north and 57 degrees 45 minutes east, the heavy steel doors of reinforced concrete bunkers slid open. 6 mobile transporter erector launchers, hidden beneath camouflage netting in the jagged coastal cliffs, tilted their canisters toward the Gulf. Within seconds, the morning stillness was shattered by the roar of solid-fuel rocket boosters. 24 Ghadir anti-ship cruise missiles transitioned from the land to the air, leaving behind thick plumes of gray smoke that lingered in the stagnant coastal heat. The missiles dropped to an altitude of only 10 meters above the waves, flying at a high subsonic speed of 950 kilometers per hour. Their internal radar seekers were silent, relying on inertial guidance to close the gap toward the massive electronic signature of the wounded USS Carl Vinson. This was a saturation attack designed to overwhelm the defensive perimeter of the escorts while they were distracted by the search for the submarine. On the bridge of the cruiser USS Princeton, the AN/SPY-1 Delta radar system was the first to see the vampires, the military code for incoming hostile missiles. The radar, capable of tracking hundreds of targets simultaneously, instantly categorized the threat. The lighting in the Combat Information Center shifted from blue to a sharp, high-intensity red. The tactical action officer did not hesitate. He authorized the use of the Aegis combat system in auto-special mode, allowing the ship's computers to prioritize and engage the most immediate threats with machine speed. The air around the USS Princeton and the USS Kidd erupted into a violent display of American firepower. From the Mark 41 vertical launch systems, a sequence of SM-2 Block 3B standard missiles screamed into the sky. Each launch was a rhythmic, bone-shaking thump, followed by a pillar of orange flame that bleached the pre-dawn darkness. 32 interceptors were in the air within 20 seconds, their rocket motors carving white streaks across the sky as they arched over the horizon to meet the incoming cruise missiles. The first engagement occurred 20 miles from the carrier. The SM-2 missiles, guided by the powerful radar beams of the destroyers, intercepted the Iranian Ghadar missiles in a series of brilliant white flashes. Each impact was a collision of high explosives and kinetic energy, shredding the light alloy frames of the cruise missiles and sending the debris tumbling into the sea. From the deck of the Carl Vinson, the sailors could see the distant sparks of the successful intercepts, a line of fire that marked the edge of their protective shield. 2 of the Iranian missiles, however, utilized an aggressive terminal maneuver, zigzagging to evade the long-range interceptors. They breached the inner layer of the defense, coming within 4 miles of the listing carrier. The USS Wayne E. Meyer immediately engaged with its evolved Sea Sparrow missiles. These shorter-range weapons accelerated with a terrifying shriek, closing the distance in less than 5 seconds. One Ghadir was clipped in its midsection, spiraling out of control and detonating against the surface of the water in a 300-foot geyser of spray and flame. The final missile was now less than 2,000 yards away, its seeker head locked onto the massive hull of the Carl Vinson. This was the last-ditch zone. On the port and starboard galleries of the carrier, the close-in weapon systems, known as phalanx, came to life. The 20mm Gatling guns rotated at a rate of 4,500 rounds per minute. The sound was not like gunfire, but like a giant sheet of canvas being ripped apart. A stream of tungsten armor-piercing rounds created a wall of metal in the path of the incoming missile. The Ghadir took 100 hits in a fraction of a second, its warhead detonating prematurely in a massive fireball just 800 yards from the carrier's hull. The sky over the Strait of Hormuz was now a graveyard of smoke trails and falling debris. The saturation attack had failed to land a single additional blow. On the bridges of the American ships, the smell of ozone from the electronics and the bitter scent of burnt propellant from the launchers filled the air. The Aegis system had held the line. The counter-battery phase of the battle was a decisive victory for the United States Navy, but the Iranian batteries on the shore had revealed their positions. The command was given to the flight deck of the carrier. Despite the 9-degree list, the first squadron of FA-18 Golf Growlers was being fueled. The Americans were no longer interested in just shooting down missiles. They were preparing to go to the source. 5:30 in the morning. The Central Persian Gulf. The flight lead of the MH-60 Romeo Seahawk helicopter, call sign Battlecat, 7-1, transitioned into a steady hover at 40 feet above the black, churning water. The air was thick with the smell of salt and the heavy exhaust of the twin turbines, but the crew's focus was entirely below the surface. They had moved to coordinates 26 degrees, 14 minutes north, 55 degrees, 42 minutes east, following a faint acoustic lead provided by the destroyer USS Kidd. The mission was now a surgical operation to pin the Iranian Kilo-class submarine Nooh against the seafloor before it could reload its forward torpedo tubes. The sensor operator in the back of the Seahawk reached for the control stick of the AN/AQS-22 dipping sonar. With a rhythmic whirring of the hydraulic winch, the sonar transducer, a heavy, cylindrical sensor known as the Mother, was lowered into the depths on a high-strength cable. As it broke the surface and descended past 20 meters, it moved through the thermal layer. A sudden change in water temperature that acted like an acoustic mirror, reflecting sounds back toward the surface and hiding anything beneath it. By dipping through this layer, the helicopter was looking into the submarine's basement, inside the Combat Information Center of the USS Wayne E. Meyer. The undersea warfare team was working the SQQ-89 combat system. The sonar screens were a complex waterfall of green and blue light, showing the noise floor of the Persian Gulf. They were looking for the Kilo signature, a specific frequency produced by the 6-bladed skewed propeller and the rhythmic thrum of the diesel-electric cooling pumps. The challenge was the environment. The Gulf is a shallow basin, and the sound of the water was cluttered by the distant, heavy thumping of commercial oil tankers and the high-pitched clicks of snapping shrimp. It was like trying to hear a single person whispering inside a crowded stadium. The helicopter crew began the hunter's pattern, a systematic grid search designed to trap a slow-moving target. Battlecat, 7-1, dropped a pattern of 6 active sonobuoys in a circle with a radius of 2 kilometers. These buoys were pinging the water, sending out sharp bursts of acoustic energy. Simultaneously, the Seahawk's magnetic anomaly detector, a long boom extending from the tail of the aircraft, was searching for the minute distortions in the Earth's magnetic field caused by the massive steel hull of a submarine. "I have a solid return on the active buoy," the sensor operator reported, his voice calm despite the adrenaline. "Bearing 180, range 1,000 yards from the center of the pattern. Contact is stationary. Depth, 65 meters." The return was sharp and metallic. The Iranian commander had chosen his position well, tucked into a crevice beside an underwater limestone ridge. Sitting perfectly still, the submarine was nearly indistinguishable from the rock to a passive listener. But the active pings from the sono buoys were bouncing off its curved hull and returning a clear, unmistakable shape. The Ghost had a body. The USS Kidd and the USS Wayne E. Meyer adjusted their courses, closing the distance at a quiet 15 knots to minimize their own acoustic signatures. They were now operating as a single, lethal organism, linked by the Link 16 tactical data system. Every ship and aircraft in the area saw the same red icon on their screens. Submerged contact. 014. The perimeter was closing. The United States Navy was no longer searching. They were stalking. The environment in the Seahawk's cockpit, study in intense concentration. The pilots monitored their fuel states while the sensor operator interrogated the contact. They were checking the signature against the acoustic library stored in the aircraft's computer. The system confirmed the match. Type 8 to 177 EKM. An Iranian Kilo-class submarine. The Nooh was pinned against the wall. Battlecats 7 to 1. This is Kid. The radio crackled. We have a confirmed track. Transition to attack geometry. You are authorized to prosecute the contact upon positive identification of hostile intent. The helicopter pilot banked the aircraft, the rotors biting into the air as they moved into the drop position. In the belly of the Seahawk, the locking pins on the Mark 54 lightweight torpedo were armed. The weapon, a technical masterpiece of acoustic guidance and shaped charge explosives, was ready to be released into the dark. Below them, the Iranian crew likely heard the rhythmic, metallic pinging growing louder and faster, a sound that told them the Americans were no longer looking for them. They had been found. The silence in the Strait of Hormuz was about to be broken for the last time that morning. The hunt was over, and the kill was being calculated in milliseconds by the processors of the American fleet. 5:45 in the morning, coordinates 26 degrees 14 minutes north, 55 degrees 42 minutes east. The pilot of Battlecat 7 to 1 toggled the master arm switch and squeezed the release trigger on the cyclic. Beneath the fuselage of the MH-60 Romeo helicopter, the heavy locking lugs of the starboard weapon station snapped open with a mechanical clank. The Mark 54 lightweight torpedo dropped through the humid air, its stabilizing parachute deploying for a fraction of a second before the weapon hit the water with a sharp, metallic splash. The smell of burning magnesium from the torpedo's seawater battery filled the cockpit as the weapon's thermal engine ignited, driving the high-speed propeller into a blur of 45 knots. The torpedo's acoustic seeker head immediately went active, sending out high-frequency pings that sliced through the thermal layer like a blade. It searched for the massive steel shadow of the Iranian Kilo-class submarine Nooh, which was currently attempting a desperate sprint to break contact. The torpedo adjusted its control fins, banking hard to the left as it locked onto the rhythmic, metallic thrum of the submarine's electric motor. The impact was a catastrophic collision of physics and high explosives. The Mark 54 torpedo struck the Kilo-class submarine directly behind the sail, at the weakest point of the pressure hull. The 44-kilogram shaped charge warhead detonated instantly, focusing a jet of molten copper and high-pressure gas that punched straight through the 2-inch thick steel plating. The ocean, under the weight of 60 meters of pressure, followed the jet of fire into the hull. The central command compartment of the Nooh erupted as the internal atmosphere was compressed to the point of spontaneous combustion, a flash of orange fire visible even through the churning surface of the Gulf. Inside the submarine, the Iranian crew had no time to reach for emergency breathing apparatus. The blast wave from the torpedo detonation traveled through the narrow corridors at the speed of sound, shattering every light fixture and collapsing the lungs of the men in the engine room instantly. The heavy steel bulkheads, designed to withstand the crushing weight of the deep, buckled inward like wet cardboard under the force of the secondary explosions. Seawater roared into the battery compartment, reacting with the lead-acid cells to produce thick clouds of toxic chlorine gas. The submarine groaned, a sound of 1,000-ton steel plates grinding against each other as the keel snapped under the overwhelming stress of the flooding. The Nooh did not slide gracefully to the bottom. It tumbled through the water column, the stern heavy with hundreds of tons of seawater, while the bow pointed toward the surface in a final, useless gesture. As the pressure increased during the descent, the remaining air pockets in the forward torpedo room imploded with a series of dull, underwater thuds that were recorded by the sonar technicians on the USS Kidd 3 miles away. The sound was like a giant fist crushing a soda can, followed by a long, haunting silence that vibrated through the hulls of the American destroyers. By 5:52 in the morning, the surface of the Persian Gulf was no longer black. A massive, shimmering slick of diesel fuel and hydraulic fluid began to spread across the 2-meter swells, catching the first pale rays of the rising sun. Debris, consisting of cork insulation, wooden deck grating, and shattered fragments of the internal hull, began to bob to the surface amidst a rising cloud of silver bubbles. The MH-60 Romeo helicopter circled the site, its dipping sonar recording nothing but the sound of silt settling. On the seafloor 60 meters below, the threat from the depths had been neutralized, and the ocean was once again still. 6:15 in the morning, the central Persian Gulf, 40 miles south of the Quoin Islands. The sun rose over a horizon, blurred by the Proctus Sincesteter haze of humidity and the lingering gray pillar of smoke rising from the port side of the USS Carl Vinson. The aircraft carrier, a massive Vinson action, island of steel, sat heavy and awkward in the 2-meter swells, its 9-degree list, creating a surreal, tilted world for the 5,000 sailors on board. The immediate combat had subsided, but a different kind of war was being waged. In the passageways and on the hangar deck, a war against time, trauma, and the relentless pull of the sea. On the hangar deck, which had been converted into a massive triage center, the environment was a study in controlled intensity. The air smelled of antiseptic, copper-scented blood, and the scorched earth odor of flash-burnt uniforms. 312 sailors had been pulled from the flooded engineering spaces and the compartments adjacent to the torpedo impact zones. Corpsmen and Navy doctors moved between rows of stretchers, their blue camouflaged uniforms stained dark as they applied high-pressure tourniquets and administered morphine. The deck, tilted and slick, made every movement a challenge of balance. Yet the medical teams worked with the surgical precision of a shoreside trauma center. At coordinates 26 degrees 0 to 5 minutes north, 54 degrees 58 minutes east, the hospital ship USNS Mercy was already steaming at top speed to rendezvous with the strike group. The 1,000-bed floating hospital, painted brilliant white with massive red crosses on its hull, was the destination for the most critically injured. To bridge the gap, the strike group commander initiated a continuous air bridge. The flight deck of the Carl Vinson, normally a chaotic ballet of fighter jets, was now a dedicated medical evacuation platform. 4 MH-60 Sierra helicopters from Sea Combat Squadron 15 hovered in a tight pattern, their rotors whipping the humid air into a frenzy. Because of the 9-degree list, the pilots had to hover, with one wheel barely touching the deck, while crews sprinted uphill to load litters into the cabins. Each helicopter carried 4 critically wounded sailors, lifting off every 5 minutes in a rhythmic cycle of rescue. The sound of the twin turbines was a constant, reassuring roar that drowned out the groans of the shifting ship. Below the waterline, the battle for the ship's stability continued. The damage control officer, working from a secondary station after the primary center was partially flooded, coordinated the counter-flooding effort. To correct the 9-degree list to port, he ordered the intentional flooding of the starboard ballast tanks and fuel bunkers. It was a dangerous, delicate calculation. Adding more weight, a ship already taking on thousands of tons of seawater. Open valves 4 Alpha through 4 Delta, the officer commanded, into his headset. Give me another 200 tons in the starboard outer voids. We need to get that deck level enough to launch the remaining search and rescue birds. The sound of seawater rushing into the starboard tanks echoed through the lower decks, a deep, hollow thrumming that vibrated through the boots of the engineering teams. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the horizon through the hangar deck openings began to straighten. Over the course of 45 minutes, the list was reduced from 9 degrees to a more manageable 5 degrees. This stabilization allowed the heavy lift cranes to begin moving the damaged F-35 Bravo fighters away from the edge of the flight deck, securing the multi-million-dollar assets against further shifting. Logistics vessels from the Military Sealift Command, including the fast combat support ship USNS Supply, began to close the distance. They carried the specialized underwater welding equipment and massive industrial pumps required to reinforce the temporary patches on the hull. The coordination was seamless, a testament to the deep water sustainment capabilities of the United States Navy. Even as the carrier bled, the umbilical cords of the fleet were being attached, providing the fuel, power, and parts necessary to keep the heart of the strike group beating. By 7:45 in the morning, The first wave of 52 critically injured sailors had been stabilized and moved into the intensive care units of the USNS Mercy. The air bridge remained active, a silver line of helicopters stretching across the blue-green water of the Gulf. The USS Carl Vinson was no longer a weapon of offense, but she was a stable platform. The crew had looked into the abyss of a sinking hull and, through raw discipline and technical mastery, had pulled their ship back from the edge. The immediate crisis of the flooding was under control, but the strategic situation was still volatile. To the north, the Iranian coastal batteries were rearming, and the American response was no longer a matter of if, but how hard the hammer would fall. 8:15 in the morning. Over the central Persian Gulf, at an altitude of 35,000 feet, the silence of the high-altitude atmosphere was broken by the rhythmic, low-frequency hum of 4 General Electric F-101 turbofan engines. 2 Bone B Lancer bombers, belonging to the 9th Expeditionary Bomb Squadron, had arrived on station after a short flight from Al Udeid Air Base. To the sailors on the surface, the aircraft were invisible, mere silver slivers against the pale blue of the morning sky. But their presence signaled a fundamental shift in the tactical balance of the engagement. The United States Air Force had entered the battle space, and the era of Iranian surface maneuvers was coming to a violent conclusion. The mission was maritime strike total denial. The objective was to neutralize the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy fast attack craft that were attempting to swarm the outer perimeter of Carrier Strike Group 1. At coordinates 26 degrees, 22 minutes north, and 56 degrees, 0 to 8 minutes east, a formation of 12 Iranian speedboats, each armed with heavy machine guns and short-range anti-ship missiles, was moving at 50 knots toward the destroyer USS Kidd. They were attempting to exploit the carrier's reduced mobility, hoping to find a gap in the defensive screen. Inside the cockpit of the lead Bone B Lancer, callsign Bone 0 to 1, the weapons systems officer adjusted the feed from the Sniper Advanced Targeting Pod. On the high-definition display, the Iranian boats appeared as sharp, black heat signatures against the cool gray of the water. The aircraft's internal weapons bays, capable of carrying 75,000 pounds of ordnance, were already primed. For this mission, the bombers were carrying the AGM-158 Charlie, the long-range anti-ship missile. Targeting data uploaded to the bus, the weapons systems officer reported, his voice flat and professional. 8 units identified, weapons free. The heavy rotary launchers inside the bomber's belly began to turn with a mechanical groan. One by one, 4 long-range anti-ship missiles were released into the slipstream. The missiles, designed with stealthy profiles to evade radar detection, dropped 500 feet before their small turbojet engines ignited. They did not fly in a straight line. Instead, they communicated with each other via an automated data link, coordinate a multi-axis attack that would strike the Iranian formation from 4 different directions simultaneously. The missiles skimmed just 5 meters above the waves, invisible to the infrared sensors of the Iranian speedboats. When they reached a range of 2 miles, the missiles popped up. To a higher altitude, their seekers identifying the exact center of each vessel. The impact was absolute. Each 500-pound blast fragmentation warhead was designed to destroy a destroyer. Against a 15-meter speedboat, the effect was total vaporization. 4 massive pillars of white water and orange flame erupted. In the middle of the Iranian formation, there were no survivors, and no wreckage larger than a briefcase remained on the surface. Seeing the destruction of their lead element, the remaining 8 Iranian boats attempted to break formation and flee toward the safety of the coastal shallows near Keshem Island. They did not realize that the Bone B Lancers were also carrying GBU-54 laser JDAM bombs, weapons specifically designed to hit moving targets at sea. The bombers banked into a steep turn, the variable sweep wings moving forward to provide maximum lift. The weapons systems officer used a joystick to paint the lead retreating boat with a high-powered laser beam. Laser on. Pickle. A 500-pound bomb fell from the aircraft, guided by a combination of GPS and the reflected laser energy. It struck the Iranian boat directly on the engine housing. The explosion tore the vessel in half, sending the bow section tumbling through the air like a discarded toy. Over the next 6 minutes, the two bombers systematically picked off the remaining 7 boats. The high-speed chase was over before the Iranians could even clear the 12-mile limit of international waters. The environment over the Strait of Hormuz began to change. The frantic radio chatter from the Iranian Coastal Command, which had been filled with aggressive orders just an hour prior, began to fade into a series of panicked reports. The United States Air Force had established a kill box that effectively paralyzed any Iranian naval movement. The Bone B Lancers remained on station, their massive fuel tanks allowing them to loiter for hours, waiting for any hull to break the surface of the water. On the bridge of the USS Carl Vinson, the strike group commander received the confirmation of the surface sweep. The immediate perimeter was clear. The threat from the Iranian Navy's surface fleet had been reduced to 0 in the span of 15 minutes. The American professional machine was now fully spun up, and the focus was shifting from defense to a coordinated, strategic retaliation. The United States Navy was no longer just holding the line. It was preparing to dismantle the infrastructure that had allowed the attack to happen in the first place. 9:15 in the morning. The cruiser USS Princeton and the destroyer USS Kidd turned their bows toward the Iranian coast, their Mark 41 vertical launch systems prepared for a coordinated strike. The Gulf morning was already blistering, the air shimmering with a heat haze that tasted of diesel and salt. Following the near loss of an American supercarrier, the rules of engagement had shifted from containment to the systematic dismantling of the adversary's offensive infrastructure. The target was the Bandar Abbas Naval Base, specifically the hardened submarine pens, and the command and control bunkers that had directed the morning's ambush. Inside the Combat Information Center of the USS Princeton, the atmosphere was one of clinical, lethal focus. The tactical action officer monitored the mission plan on a large screen display, where 48 targets were highlighted in amber. These coordinates had been refined by satellite intelligence and the electronic signatures gathered during the earlier engagement. The order was given to execute the retaliation strike. There was no hesitation, only the rhythmic execution of a long-practiced doctrine. The firing circuit was closed. A sequence of 24 BGM-109 Tomahawk land attack missiles began their journey from the decks of the American warships. Each launch was a violent, physical event. A heavy steel hatch snapped open, followed by a thunderous crack as the booster motor ignited. A pillar of white smoke and orange fire punched straight up from the deck, reaching 200 feet into the air before the missile's wings deployed and it leveled off for its long-range flight. The sound was a rhythmic, bone-shaking roar that echoed across the surface of the water, leaving behind the sharp, chemical bite of solid fuel propellant. The Tomahawks flew at an altitude of only 30 meters, weaving through the jagged coastal mountains of Iran to mask their approach from land-based radar. They were silent, subsonic hunters, their internal cameras comparing the terrain below to digital maps stored in their memory. As they reached the outskirts of Bandar Abbas, the missiles separated into 3 distinct groups to strike the naval base, from the north, south, and west simultaneously. The lead Tomahawk missile punched straight through the 12-meter-thick reinforced concrete roof of the primary submarine pen. The 1,000-pound high-explosive warhead detonated inside the cavernous structure, the blast wave confined by the heavy walls. The roof lifted 3 meters into the air before collapsing back down, crushing the support equipment and the remaining Kilo-class submarine moored inside. A fireball that bleached the sky white erupted from the entrance of the pen, followed by a shockwave that shattered every window within a 2-kilometer radius. Secondary explosions began to ripple through the facility as fuel lines and torpedo storage bunkers were ignited by the initial strike. The Iranian defenders reacted with desperate, uncoordinated fury. Battery after battery of HQ-9 surface-to-air missiles and ZU-23 anti-aircraft guns opened fire into the morning sky. Tracers stitched red lines across the horizon, but they were firing at ghosts. The Tomahawks had already completed their terminal dives. On the ground, Iranian sailors and Revolutionary Guard personnel scrambled for cover, their voices lost in the roar of the collapsing infrastructure. One anti-aircraft crew managed to track a late-arriving missile, their shells clipping its wing, but the Tomahawk merely corrected its flight path and drove into a fuel storage tank, turning the eastern edge of the base into a lake of fire. Black smoke rose in a massive, mushroom-shaped cloud from the ruins of the Bandar Abbas naval base, visible to commercial aircraft 100 miles away. The submarine pens were no longer a functional military asset, they were a smoking graveyard of twisted rebar and scorched concrete. The air over the coast was filled with the sound of sirens and the distant, secondary thumps of ammunition cooking off in the heat. The command and control center, buried 50 feet underground, had been severed from the outside world by a penetrator warhead that had turned the electronics into a mass of molten plastic and copper. On the bridge of the USS Princeton, the commanding officer watched the real-time battle damage assessment from a drone orbiting the target area. The strike had been 100% effective. The infrastructure that allowed Iran to project power into the Strait of Hormuz had been obliterated in less than 10 minutes. The United States Navy had delivered a clear, proportional, and devastating message. As the Tomahawks settled into their final impacts, the American ships began to turn back toward the USS Carl Vinson. The retaliation was complete, but the long process of securing the region and bringing the wounded carrier home was just beginning. The morning of fire was transitioning into an afternoon of strategic reassessment. 4:30 in the afternoon. The Central Persian Gulf, 60 miles south of the Strait of Hormuz, USS Carl Vinson was no longer moving under its own power. The nuclear-powered supercarrier, once the apex predator of the Fifth Fleet, was tethered to the ocean-going tug USNS Apache by two massive 8-inch thick synthetic hawsers. The ship was moving at a painful 4 knots, a slow and heavy crawl toward the deep-water repair facilities at Jebel Ali in the United Arab Emirates. The list to port had been reduced to a stable 3 degrees, but the massive, jagged hole in its side remained a raw, open wound, blackened by fire and constantly lapped by the green water of the Gulf. The environment around the carrier was one of somber, exhausted professional focus. The humid afternoon air was thick with the smell of stagnant seawater, burnt electrical wiring, and the persistent, oily scent of the diesel fuel that still coated the lower decks. Sailors, their faces hollowed by 36 hours of continuous duty, sat on the flight deck in small groups, drinking water and staring at the horizon. The aggressive roar of flight operations had been replaced by the low, mechanical thrum of portable industrial pumps and the rhythmic clink of metal as damage control teams continued to reinforce the internal shoring. The official mission assessment was transmitted from the commander of Carrier Strike Group 1 to the Indo-Pacific Command at 5 in the evening. The report was a clinical, honest accounting of the cost of the engagement. The United States Navy had suffered its most significant combat damage since the Second World War. The final casualty count was confirmed at 48 personnel killed in action, most of whom had been lost in the initial flooding of the auxiliary machinery rooms. Another 342 sailors were listed as injured, with 64 in critical condition aboard the hospital ship USNS Mercy. The material cost was equally staggering. In addition to the structural damage to the hull of the USS Carl Vinson, 6 F-35 Bravo Lightning fighters and 2 MH-60 Sierra helicopters had been written off as total losses, either destroyed by the torpedo shockwave or jettisoned to stabilize the deck. Preliminary estimates for the repair of the carrier were placed at over $2 billion, and the ship was expected to be out of operational service for at least 18 to 24 months. However, the assessment also detailed the total neutralization of the opposing force. The Iranian Kilo-class submarine Nooh had been confirmed destroyed with all hands lost. 12 fast attack craft had been vaporized, and the primary submarine pens at Bandar Abbas had been rendered structurally unsound for the foreseeable future. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy had been effectively decapitated in a single morning, its ability to contest the Strait of Hormuz reduced to 0. The total denial objective had been achieved, albeit at a price that would be debated in the halls of the Pentagon for decades. As the sun began to set, casting long, orange shadows across the mangled steel of the hangar deck, the strategic reinforcement of the region was already visible. On the western horizon, the silhouettes of 3 more Arleigh Burke-class destroyers and the carrier USS Ronald Reagan were appearing, redirected from the Mediterranean to fill the vacuum left by the Vinson's departure. The United States Navy was not withdrawing. It was doubling down, saturating the Gulf with enough sensor and strike capacity to ensure that no other submarine would dare to cycle its torpedo tubes. Inside the captain's cabin on the Carl Vinson, the atmosphere was quiet. The commanding officer sat at his desk, signing the initial letters of condolence to the families of the fallen. Outside his porthole, the water was calm, showing no sign of the violence that had erupted just 12 hours prior. The ship groaned as it adjusted to the tension of the tow lines, a sound of heavy steel protesting its own weight. It was the sound of a survivor. The battle for the Strait of Hormuz was over. The regional maritime transit lanes remained open, and the oil tankers continued their slow, rhythmic crawl toward the global markets. Unaware of how close the world had come to a total economic collapse, the United States Navy had held the line, protecting the global commons through a combination of advanced technology and the raw, unbreakable will of its sailors. The Carl Vinson was wounded, and its decks were stained, but its flag was still flying as it crossed the 12-mile limit into the safety of territorial waters. The morning of fire had ended in an afternoon of cold, hard reality. The mission was complete, the enemy was neutralized, and the long, difficult road to recovery had begun.